Be'ezras Hashem. With the help of Hashem, I want to speak to you about credentials. I have in my pocket a driver's license, which is a type of credential. Now, I'm not legally authorized to be behind the wheel of a car unless I have this credential. It shows clearly who I am. Has a picture of me. It has the color of my eyes. It has my address. No one is legally authorized to drive an automobile without this credential. So I could say to you, don't claim to be me if you do not have my credentials. If you do claim to be me, you are an imposter. You are not me. You are impersonating me. This is called identity theft. In the same way, no one is authorized to claim to be the Moshiach if they don't have the biblical credentials. In Brooklyn, we have a group that is engaging in identity theft, claiming that they have the Moshiach when their candidate lacks the credentials Hashem requires in the inerrant Tanakh. Now, worse than this, much worse than this, someone not having my identification credentials yet claiming to be me. Because in this case, we're talking about Moshiach's redemption. In this case, we are talking about the blind leading the blind in a detour away from salvation, which is more than a crime. It is pseudo-Yiddishkeit, shmad, apostasy from the Jewish religion. Rabbis should know better. If the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit. Now let's talk about Moshiach's credentials. No one can claim to be the Moshiach if they don't have his credentials. But you say, but he's a great rabbi. I don't care who he is. No one can claim to be Moshiach if they don't have Moshiach's credentials. What credentials am I talking about? I'm talking about the Tanakh, Baruch Hashem. You would do well to read it, particularly if you claim to be a teacher in Israel. Read the prophet Micah, where Moshiach has to have Beit Lechem and only Beit Lechem as his address of his birthplace. No other address of his birthplace will do. So if you have a candidate for Moshiach and your candidate wasn't born in Beit Lechem, you have a false Moshiach. You have an impostor without credentials. You have identity theft. You have pseudo-Yiddishkeit, shmad, apostasy from the Jewish religion. So let's talk about Moshiach credentials in the Torah. Look at Moshe Rabbeinu, who wanted to offer himself as a kapora for the Jewish people, Shemot 32, Exodus 32. But Isaiah said, no, Moshe, another one is coming. The kapora that Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to make is going to be made by the Moshiach. Moshiach ben David will offer his own nefesh as a kapora. He will be like the Pesach Say Elokim, the lamb, and he will have a kever, a tomb. But we know from the Psalms that there will be no shachat, no rotting, no corruption in his kever, in Moshiach's tomb. Psalm 16 says that, and this is part of the Moshiach's credentials. So if you have a candidate for Moshiach and your candidate is rotting in his grave, then he lacks the credentials of Isaiah and the Psalms. He is an imposter without proper biblical identification credentials. And that means that you have, in that case, identity theft. You have pseudo-Yiddishkeit, shmad, apostasy from the Jewish religion. So I know from the Psalms that Psalm 16, that there would be no shachat, no rotting, no corruption, no corruption in Moshiach's kever or tomb. And after Moshiach is made kapora by his death, Isaiah says his days will be prolonged. Now, if his days are prolonged after his death, that prolongation of his days after his death requires an empty tomb. Furthermore, the promises that King David made to King David in 2 Shmuel, in Isaiah, in Zechariah, all these promises spoke of the Tzemach Tzaddik, the righteous branch. But if you have a candidate for Moshiach and you say that your candidate has that credential, the credential of the Tzemach Tzaddik, then, my friend, his name had better be Joshua or Yehoshua in Hebrew, because if his name is anything else, he is an impostor and not the true Moshiach. He is an impostor without proper biblical identification credentials. You have identity theft. You have pseudo-Yiddishkeit, shmad, apostasy from the Jewish religion. You say, why does he have to have that personal name? The answer is because the personal name of the righteous branch, Moshiach ben David, is given in Zechariah chapter 6, and Moshiach's personal name that is given in the Tanakh of Rabbinic Judaism is given as Joshua or Yehoshua in Hebrew. This is the name of the coming Moshiach's namesake, the Kohen Gadol, who rebuilt the second temple in 515 BCE. Zechariah pointed to the name of this Kohen Gadol, and his personal name was Yehoshua. And Zechariah said that this name is the name of Moshiach, the Tzemach Tzaddik. So it doesn't matter whether you agree with Zechariah or not. You, friend, are not calling the shots. You're in the same league, not in the same league with Zechariah. He is the canonical Navi of the inerrant Hebrew Tanakh. You are not. So if you have a candidate for Moshiach and your candidate has some other personal name, then he lacks the credentials of Zechariah, the credentials of the Tanakh. He is an imposter without proper biblical identification credentials. That's identity theft. That's Yiddishkeit, pseudo-Yiddishkeit, Shema apostasy from the Jewish religion. No person can claim to be the Moshiach if he doesn't have these credentials. But really no applicant for Moshiach need apply, because in chapter 9 the prophet Daniel talks about the Churban. That is the destruction of the second temple, and says that Moshiach ben David will be cut off or violently killed, and not for himself. And the prophet Daniel says the coming death or the stalkus of the Moshiach would take place before the Churban. So if you have a candidate for Moshiach, but your candidate came after the 70 CE Churban of the Beis HaMikdash, rather than before the Churban, as the prophet Daniel prescribes, well, you have a false Moshiach without proper credentials, a false claimant, an impostor, false claimant to the throne of Moshiach. You have pseudo-Yiddishkeit, Shmad, apostasy from the Jewish religion. Isaiah says, Ki nigzar me eretz chayim mi pesha mi. Isaiah says he was not put to death for himself, but for the sins of my Jewish people. But after that he makes a kapora for my people's sins. Hashem prolongs Moshiach's days. And that prolongation requires an empty tomb. So if your candidate for Moshiach does not have an empty tomb, if your candidate for Moshiach is definitely occupying a definitely not empty tomb, then you are promoting a false Moshiach, an impostor, without biblical credentials. You are promoting some kind of pseudo-Yiddishkeit, Shema apostasy from the Jewish religion.